On behalf of TasCOSS and Anglicare, a very warm welcome to everyone to our forum this afternoon. We've decided to mount this forum during this very important Anti-Poverty Week because we think this is an issue very strongly associated with poverty, which we don't want to have on the back burner. We needed to bring it forward again and talk more about this because, as you'll probably be aware, although that poker machine reform seems to have receded from the public view at the moment, the needs of people with gambling problems, particularly those on low incomes or suffering from some form of disadvantage, certainly have not gone away. More than 2,500 Tasmanians have a gambling problem, and I just realised, by the way, I didn't say who I was too. My name's Tony Reidy from TasCOSS. 2,500 Tasmanians have a gambling problem, and studies show that for every person with a gambling problem, another 5 to 10 people are affected. This means the lives of approximately 27,500 Tasmanians are affected by gambling problems, even more by some estimates. This includes an estimated 2,000 children who live in a household affected by those problems. Any story of gambling problems is a human tragedy. In this context of Anti-Poverty Week, however, TasCOSS and Anglicare want to draw special attention to the especially harsh impact that gambling problems have on low-income and disadvantaged Tasmanians. As you'll hear from our speakers, gambling problems hit the most vulnerable the hardest. People on a low income have a few resources to buffer themselves against gambling losses, and those losses can rapidly turn into spiralling debts, leaving individuals and families even worse off. The toll that stress and financial hardship inflict on gamblers' physical and mental health, relationships, children and other family members is absolutely huge. Our speakers have extensive professional and personal understanding of this toll. Between them, they have collected information, they've heard stories, and they've lived through experiences that bring home the human cost of gambling problems for low-income and disadvantaged Tasmanians. And before we go to our first speaker, just a couple of housekeeping things if I can. Please help yourself to tea and coffee and biscuits at the back. We will serve some afternoon tea later on. You can see a sign there that says toilets. Unfortunately, that is actually the door to the toilet, so that's a coincidence. And we'll have a break about halfway through, and we'll also have opportunity for questions at the end of proceedings today as well. And People Before Pokies are selling some, or would like a gold coin donation. If you'd like to pick up one of these car stickers, the Pokey always wins at the back of the room. Please do so to support their campaign. Now, our first speaker this afternoon is Greg James. Now, he's seen the impact of gambling problems on low-income and disadvantaged Tasmanians from the perspective of that of a publican. Greg has not only run pubs himself, but is also the former president of the Australian Hotels Association in Tasmania and a past chairman of Host Plus, the Hospitality Industry National Superannuation Fund. Please welcome Greg.
Hi, and thanks for coming. I'm not used to giving speeches, as you'll see. Now I've lost all my notes. And in 1994, I became president of the AHA. I went down to the Taste of Tasmania, grabbed a bottle of wine, sat down, just as another fellow sat down. And we sat there and we drank 2 bottles of wine between us. The other guy was Bishop Peter Newell. And in the course of the conversation, he repeated to me something called the 6 Ps of people who look after other people. And he started out with police and prostitutes, physicians and physicians and policemen, physicians, priests, politicians, prostitutes, and publicans. He claimed that these 6 professions looked after people. In those days, we did look after people in hotels. We would explain documentation to them, we would explain their bail applications, we would explain their legal ramifications, we would take them home, we would see inside their houses, we would be interested in their lives. 20 years later, we've got a situation where 100 of the 300 hotels in this state do not have gaming machines, and have actually started to suck the money out of their communities and stop this building of a community, and they've taken the reverse road, which is exploitation. In 1994, there were 5,000 jobs in the hospitality industry, and in 2012, there's still only 5,000 jobs. It is not a coincidence that the introduction of gaming and this lack of job creation are tied together. They are very tied together in that the hospitality industry essentially stopped developing and growing from that point, from 1995, when the hotels, 100 hotels, received gaming. Tourism has basically stalled. There's no backpackers in this state. There's no development or innovation. The innovation that does occur is in the 5-star range, not at the bottom end of the industry. And the reason I bring this up is because hospitality is essentially a low-skilled job. Barriers to entry to employment are minor, and many of you would have gone through university working in pubs and clubs around the state. And because of its easy entry, it was a source of employment, even though it was the lowest income unskilled jobs you could find. It was a source of employment for people in low socioeconomic situations, most especially casual mums. The fact is that the industry stopped developing. This no doubt has affected employment. The other things that have occurred is that because the industry itself has stalled, we don't get a renewal of people coming in with new ideas. For instance, New Zealand has depended on the backpacker industry, and lots of those backpackers actually turn up and marry Kiwis. With the interesting development, they improve the... I won't go there. In Tasmania, $610,000 per day flows down the gullet of these machines. It produces nothing except bells and whistles. It doesn't do anything within the pub industry. It doesn't create employment, as I've said, and in fact nobbles the local areas, the local government areas. The effect of this is a negative one from the point of view of the industry, in that hotel prices are essentially the same as they were when poker machines were introduced. There's been almost no change. You might have changed the value of your house, but the value of the hotels hasn't changed in that 20 years. This $610,000 a day, it doesn't flow to the community. The money is essentially removed out of circulation. That means that people don't go home and put food on their table. They don't buy it from their local shop. They don't employ the local painter to improve their house. They don't use the local dry cleaners. They don't use the local newsagents because their money is going somewhere else. Now, if this does not affect local council valuations, I'm very surprised. But this $610,000 a day is the equivalent of 20,500 working days. That's 20,500 people employed at $30 an hour. This means unemployment is severely affected by this loss of money out of circulation. You will have seen around the state various places that do not have poker machines, like Sullivan's Coves and Salamanca, where there are vibrant entertainment industries and vibrant employment, as opposed to, say, Glenorchy, where there is a preponderance of machines. I've actually found something in the this book, which is the Productivity Commission's inquiry report on gambling and poker machines, says here, Del Fabrio, who did an inquiry, also found a high correlation between gaming machine density and the proportion of the population who had sought help from treatment services. Based on 2005-6 data, they estimated that variation in the density of gaming machines accounted for 77% of the variation in gambling machine expenditure per adult. And in contrast with Diamond found that the average daily per capita expenditure was higher for more disadvantaged local government areas, and they go on and name Victorian areas, than for less disadvantaged areas, such as Sandy Bay, Mount Nelson, etc. And the disadvantaged areas here would be Glenorchy and Newstead in Lonnie, where there are lots of machines. The effect on on these communities by from these machines has been to actually stop development, not just in the hotel industry, but in the local areas. The money that flows into these machines is not returned to the community, despite community support levies. It's removed. And where does it go to? Well, nobody really knows, but it certainly doesn't stay in the communities. The hotel industry is also an entry point into small business. When when some people decide to enter small business and start employing people, pub is one of the few places they can enter without a skill base. Just needs a bit of money and a bit of common sense. There is no test for licensing. There is no, which one wonders then why you have a license. There's no barrier to entry as great as, say, as entering a dry cleaners, where you have to do training. Very little training occurs in the hotel industry, other than on the job. The responsible service of alcohol has proven over the years to be a toothless tiger, and which gets me to the point about pubs supervising their clientele. If they cannot do it for their main product, which is alcohol, and they do it badly when they do it with alcohol, how can you actually expect them to do a good job policing people who are caught with a gaming addiction? I think it's an unreal expectation for the hotel industry to be asked to do this, primarily because their skill level is so low. And their responsibility is also low in terms of the number of actions that have occurred in court where people have claimed that a club or hotel has exploited them because of their combination of addiction and alcohol. The number of times this has been defeated when it's got to the High Court in Australia is almost 100%, because the court depends on the idea of personal responsibility, and clearly it isn't working. The personal responsibility in front of a gaming machine, which is contrived to addict you, is minimalised. I have seen people exiting gaming hotels. I saw one guy sit in his car and tear the interior part of his car apart in total frustration, screaming out, "Why did I do it? This is the third time," and I think it was 6 weeks he'd lost his wages down the machines. The idea that pubs can exert can exert control over people addicted to these machines is a furphy, and it's not worth pursuing, primarily from my point of view because of the low skills and the low level of responsibility already accepted in pubs for bad behaviour. I don't have much more to add. Thank you.
Greg, thank you very much. For those people who've joined us while Greg was speaking, welcome to the TasCOSS Anglicare Forum on gambling. And Greg just gave the perspective of the publican, both in that role as taking care of both the patrons and the punters, and we can see that there may be some failings there, as he's pointed out to us. Our next speaker is Mara Lovrin of Gamblers Help in Anglicare. Now, as a counsellor and a community educator, Mara has heard many stories of hardship and heartbreak stemming from gambling problems. Would you please welcome Mara?
Well, good afternoon, and I'm not very good at standing and speaking, but today I'm actually going to speak to what I see in the public and how that affects people in terms of my work as a Gamblers Help counsellor and community educator. I've been in that role now since March, and I have to say that I'm seeing more and more people increasingly accessing our services and coming through the door. But what I wanted to speak to is that human face, of gambling. It's the face of helplessness and hopelessness, and that's not always from those that are classified as being at-risk communities. So that's across the board, and I want to talk to that face. My sons, when they were growing up, said, "Mum, don't talk about India, you're always talking about India." But last year I worked in India as a volunteer, and I saw poverty, I saw drug, alcohol, I saw helplessness, and I saw gambling on the streets everywhere that I went. Our face is not quite that clear in terms of gambling and in terms of what we see in Tasmania, but there is a very real need out there for people to see that face of gambling and what it does not only to the person who is gambling, but to significant others, to families, to spouses, to children. And in terms of Anti-Poverty Week, in terms of how many people are affected, I think the statistics were around 45,000 people living below the poverty line, then we're going to see this more. And the effects on families is devastating. My role means that I get to talk to many people in the public. I work as a counsellor. I get to see people come in who want to self-exclude. I get to see people come in to Anglicare who come in and they will talk about financial situation, financial hardship, and then eventually they will say, I am a problem gambler. It's not always the first thing that they will say, which is associated with the shame, of course, that gamblers often feel. So at that side of my role, I see that hardship and work with families and significant others. And I also work as a community educator, and so I work with groups. We have quite a number of groups that are running out there for those at-risk communities. So we're talking about people who can least afford to lose their money. Many Tasmanians gamble, and many without any cost. They can walk in, they can play, and they can leave. But there are many who cannot do that, and they need our support. In terms of those at-risk groups, we're talking about called communities, we're talking about mental health, disabilities, low-income earners. I see those faces, and I see them in my work all the time, and their stories are very, very real stories that this is affecting, that the pokie machines in particular are affecting Tasmanians. their families and significant others, and all the associated issues. So we're talking about relationship breakdowns, we're talking about financial hardship. I've never seen our financial counsellors so busy as they are at present. So there's a pebble effect, there's a fall down effect from all of this. One of the groups that I work with in Glenorchy area is a swimming group, and this swimming group is made up of a group that have been together now for nearly 2 years, and they have mental health and disabilities, and they all identify themselves as being problem gamblers. And I attended the swimming group, I think it was the second or third time I'd attended this group. And so we take the group down to Kingston and we do swimming with the group. When I arrived, one of the group handed me a bar of chocolate, and I knew he couldn't afford it. So I said to him, you can't afford to give me this chocolate, you need to take it back. He said to me, I can now afford to buy my niece and nephews presents at Christmas, and I can afford to buy you chocolate, and I want you to have it because I can afford to buy things now. He's a 54-year-old man, and he was a gambler for over 10 years. And I just want you, if you haven't heard it before, then I just want to read you his poem along with his chocolate. He handed me this poem, which is now sort of I guess made him feel like he's a celebrity in his own right, and he loves to tell me about how I've turned him into a celebrity by passing his poem on to Cassie O'Connor. But his story is a story of many. He grew up, he had issues with alcohol, he came from an abusive family, and then the pokies. So they were the next on his list, and after 10 years of no money, he'd had 2 years and he'd learnt to swim, and he now had money in his pocket and he could buy me chocolate. So this was the poem along with the chocolate that he handed to me, and it's called No More the Pokies. No more the pokies I'll play, no more they'll take my money on pension day, no more I'll put the coins in the slot, I'll keep the money I've got. Now I'm happy every day because the pokies I don't play. The face of gambling, as I said, is not always the at-risk communities. I also do training for the casino as part of a new pilot project, so I'm spending quite a bit of time in the casino at the moment. So the face of gambling is an interesting one, and if we look at the research and we look at Blazinski's pathways model into problem gambling, we will see that there are many ways that people find their way into problem gambling. In fact, there are 3 core ways into problem gambling. One is the identification of impulse control. I think someone's got no impulse on the hammering out there. So that can actually be linked back to childhood. So it can be linked back to those that were probably labelled as having ADHD, Asperger's, the problem kids in the group, highly intelligent, but they have impulse control. So that's the first. The second is, of course, the big win theory. And the big win theory is about that special code that they'll break, and they're going to win the big win, and they're going to take the coins home, and all their life problems will be solved. And many people keep going back time and time again for the big win, and it becomes part of their narrative, it becomes part of their story, and that story of, he's got impulse control issues, I can tell. And it becomes part of their narrative and their story around that big win. When life is hopeless, then next time they hit the machine, they're going to walk out of there and all their problems will be solved. It also links into the brain in terms of the adrenaline in the body and that addictive nature of the big win. The third is to do with environmental factors, and that's linked to times in people's lives when factors contribute to them being more likely to gamble. So it might be a relationship breakdown, it might be some kind of hardship, a death in the family, relationships, or else a husband may have passed away and the children have left home, the empty nest syndrome. And this seems to be an area that's increasing in terms of women of an older age group and the seniors age group who are finding it difficult to come to terms with their family growing up, leaving home, their husband may have passed away, and so they are socially isolated. And that is a big problem in our communities, of particularly women who are now socially isolated. And so they see the venues as warm, as safe, as a place they can go to and they can socially interact if they choose to, or sit on a machine and see themselves as having an external social interaction without having one. So it's a place that they feel they are safe. Interesting concept. But these are some of the faces of problem gambling. And as I said, it's a domino effect. It's not just the person with the problem, it's significant others. I had a woman that came in to see me the other day, and they'd had a death in their family, and her husband had been in to see one of our counsellors as he had a gambling issue. And since the death in the family, she had managed to find support within her network, and she'd been to see a counsellor about the grief and loss. Her partner had not, and so his gambling had increased, and the impact on their relationship was devastating. In fact, it didn't last, and the gambling was the straw for that family that broke the camel's back. And so the implications of that are huge. This is a family now who have felt the effects of problem gambling in an environmental time when that family was under great stress and strain. So I guess really what I'm painting is quite a bleak picture out there, and I talk to many groups about that picture, about what it looks like, what it feels like. I think is something that that doesn't get through to us. You know, we might espouse to the figures, we might discuss it, but what does that really feel like for a family that cannot afford food, cannot afford transport, cannot afford to clothe their children, cannot afford to pay their rent? What does that feel like? It doesn't feel good, and many families are becoming desperate, and in such economic times, that impact, that added environmental factor of problem gambling in families is having a devastating effect, and that's the picture that we see. So I'd like to thank you very much.
Mara, thank you very much. Mara presents a picture which goes beyond the statistics about these things, worrying that they are, and tells the story about someone who's actually working in the field day in, day out and dealing with these problems, which in a sense is a somewhat neat segue and to introduce our next speaker. But just before I introduce her, could I just check? I don't think there is, but is there anyone from the media still in the room? I don't think that's the case. No? Our colleague here is from People Before Pokies. Because our next speaker is Karyn Wagner, and she has personal experience of the impact of gambling problems. Karyn is both an advocate for the issue, as well as herself being a victim of problem gambling. And Karyn is here to tell her story. Karyn, please come forward.
Hello everyone, my name is Karyn Wagner. I'm a single mum of 2 teenagers, a girl of 16 with hormones working overtime, and a boy of 13 who recently, due to behaviour problems, I have sent to live with his dad in Queensland. I am working to beat my gambling addiction, and I would like to share my story today. Gambling has had a huge impact in my life. When growing up, it was a very common noise of horse racing in the background. I remember as a young girl waiting outside TAB venues for different family members, sometimes my nan, but more often my stepfather. I remember one occasion when my stepfather had parked outside a TAB and gone to place his bets for the Saturday, the horses and the greyhounds, also harness racing at night. My sister and I were waiting in the car for about 4 hours, sweating profusely. We were hungry, thirsty, and extremely scared. As I became older, my mid-teens, I remember visiting our grandparents in Sydney and often taken out for a counter lunch or tea and being confused as to why my sister and I had to wait in the foyer while the adults went into another area where children were forbidden. It looked and sounded so much fun, like a theme park or show with all the noise and flashing lights. I had a part-time job after school and Saturdays at Coles, and I also had a couple of ironing jobs for $4 an hour. This is probably why I hate ironing now. The money that I earned put some food on the table. The adults' money was mostly consumed by gambling. My mother always worked in TAB agencies and then had her own agency where I also started working. But eventually betting took over her life and she lost everything. Gambling has always been in my life. After my marriage ended 10 years ago, I came back to Tasmania with our 2 children and had to start my life all over. I got off the plane with only 2 suitcases and my 2 and 5-year-olds. Being impatient and wanting to stand on my own 2 feet financially, I started going to the pokies, thinking I may have that big win that would fix everything. I could get my own house, replace the kids' toys, and give them everything they ever wished for, which was impossible to do so on a pension. I never had that big win and got into strife financially. So on the 16th of August 2011, I went to Gamblers Help at Anglicare in Hobart. I entered the venue exclusion program. I wish I could say it has been easy, but in fact stopping gambling is the hardest thing I have probably ever done, and I admit that I have failed a couple of times. But each time that I do, I become stronger and hate the pokies with a vengeance. I am getting my life back. I do still get urges of wanting to gamble, but I am hoping this will get better with time. I give credit to all of the politicians, organisations and other support services for trying to make gambling an occasional pastime and not a lifestyle for people suffering from poverty and on low incomes and not being so easy to access poker machines. My grandparents had a gambling problem. My parents had a gambling problem. I have also been affected by gambling, and I don't want my children growing up thinking that gambling is a way of dealing with problems or that the problems caused by gambling are okay. I encourage anyone out there to please get help if gambling is a problem in their lives. It has as it has been in mine. Anglicare in Hobart have been such an inspiration to me in getting my life back in control. Maxine Lowry, who's with me today, has gone out of her way to praise, encourage and believe in me, and I thank her from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope I can help others to seek help in the future.
Karyn, thank you very much for providing. That's a very brave thing to do, and you've spoke so well and presented your story so very well to us. You are the human face of the very problems we're talking about here, and we need people like you to tell those stories so we can have the impact that way. And I can identify too, I was very lucky. For those of you who might have read the column I wrote for Saturday's paper, the gambling addiction fortunately stopped with my grandparents, but I said in that particular story, I was always surprised that in our neighbourhood growing up in the late 1950s, no one in our whole neighbourhood had a telephone except my grandparents, who had 5. And they used to ring in drawers and cupboards all the time. And I worked out later on they were illegal SP bookies. So I can identify with that whole thing and the impact on the family. It's a terrible syndrome, and it takes a generation to get out of it. So thank you for sharing your story. Now, our final speaker today is Margie Law of Anglicare's Social Action Research Centre. And Margie's role today was one of discussant, which I thought sounded like a delicious French dessert myself, but her role is actually to talk about, she's actually authored many of the reports from Anglicare on the topics ranging from the personal impact of gambling problems to critiques of the regulatory system relating to gaming. She's going to discuss some of the points raised by our speakers, raise some of her own, and perhaps finish with some questions that we all take away with us. Please welcome Margie.
Hello everyone, and thanks for inviting me along today, and I'd like to acknowledge that we stand on Aboriginal land and thank them for being kind to people who've taken away their rights and their land. As Tony said today, gambling problems have not diminished despite the state introducing a number of initiatives in recent years, including a smoking ban in gambling venues, reducing the maximum bet limit on poker machines from $10 to $5, and also reducing the amount paid in cash for poker machine so-called winnings. So although some initiatives have been brought in, and some of those are very welcome, the problem of gambling hasn't gone away. Now today we have focused on the pokies. Karyn also mentioned horse betting or racing. And I'd like to say, though, that while all forms of gambling can be extremely harmful to individuals, it is the pokies that are the most common form of gambling at the moment, used by people who develop a problem. And so I will continue to talk about the pokies, but I do want to emphasise that many of these issues also relate to races, online betting, sports betting, table games and so on. And in fact, as technology develops, my prediction is that the pokies will diminish, in fact disappear. We won't have pokies anymore, but it will be taken up by another technological advanced form of gambling, unless we have a big real win of reducing our desire and acceptance of gambling. And certainly sports betting is a very big unknown for us at the moment. Anyone with a smartphone who lets their child use their smartphone, whose child might look at sports on their smartphone, can place monetary bets using your credit card that's linked to your smartphone. And it's something that really we should be aware of and should be thinking about the implications of, because at the moment betting on sports on your favourite AFL team is considered to be normal practice. But with the introduction of smartphones, I think I think the community does start to need to rethink what we think is the norm. So existing measures to reduce gambling problems clearly are not enough. There's still a large number of people who are experiencing difficulties. The current Responsible Gambling Mandatory Code of Practice allows up to around about $1,000, $1,200 to be lost on the pokies every hour. And this is simply too much in anybody's calculation, whether you're on a high income or on a low income. The effects of gambling losses on individuals, families, the community and the state are much greater than the income paid to the state in licensing fees and taxes. It is in fact a negative financial activity for the state and should be seen as a cost to the state, not that they actually get income from gambling. It should be seen as a cost, and we should be minimising that cost. It's not about minimising their income, it's actually about minimising their cost, because the cost of hospitalisation, loss of work, insurance claims, fraud, prison sentences, the list goes on. All of those costs are borne by the state, but are not always put down to gambling, and so therefore not quantified against the income to the state in licensing fees and taxes. With relation to poker machines, limiting the state losses, Anglicare believes would be best done through introducing a $1 bet limit, but along with other measures, tougher harm minimisation measures, such as perhaps removing chairs from the poker machines and reducing the hours of operation. Until the state can be confident that its harm minimisation measures are effective, the state is making easy money out of the misery of people with a gambling problem. And most of their income comes from people with a gambling problem, because that's where most of the income into the pokies come from, and therefore that's where most of the taxes that they get from the poker machines come from. So we've heard some frightening statistics today, and also stories of hardship. And we've also heard that the state government gets money in, but also spends a lot of money out, and also the community as a whole does that as well. And these costs can be financial, mental, social and health. They're not always going to be easily quantifiable. So why doesn't the government do more about this issue? I was hoping that one of the speakers might raise that as a question, but I'm now going to put it out to you to answer at the end. Why doesn't the government do more about this issue? If we had 2,500 people with 27,000 people affected, so if we had 2,500 people directly affected by another issue, let's pick car accidents or bicycle accidents, would the government just allow this to continue going on? 2,500 people physically, emotionally, mentally, financially affected, and 27,500 other people indirectly affected by that. Would the government allow it to continue on? What choice does the government have, and what's limiting the government's choice? What's leading their choice in the direction that they've taken? So that's a question that I'd really like anyone to put their hand up at the end. Why isn't the government doing more about this issue? And I can see some people with some ideas. Good to see you, Nick. In 2005, I interviewed people on a low income and heard stories of very small amounts of money being lost to gambling that was causing them great difficulty. This was because their incomes were so low that small losses meant that they didn't heat their house, they had to steal to get nappies. Some of them talked about going into shops and eating food off the shelf and leaving without that food, but just eating it while it was on the shelf in order to have food in their stomachs. One of the ladies that I interviewed, I've called Maureen in my report, House of Cards, and I'd just like to read to you a short piece that she said to me, which was, I probably realised I had a problem when I would go in and I could say I can afford to lose $20, that's fine. But then I would stay and keep waiting to regain what I had lost. Then leaving, feeling really bad. It's the light, the music, the jingles, the free drinks, etc. It was one day when I put in $100, $120, and I thought, oh no, what am I doing? Why didn't I stop myself? Now, her story is not an isolated story. It's not easy for individuals to stop themselves when, as we heard from Greg, the machines are designed to make you feel like you want to stay there. And if, as we heard from Mara, if people have personal problems, financial problems, health problems, the poker machines in particular are designed to make you feel welcome. Poker machine venues are pretty friendly for people. They are open long hours. Women can go there by themselves and not get harassed. In fact, people very rarely talk to each other. And so a woman can go in there by themselves and not be concerned that they're ever going to get propositioned. People can go there and feel like they're in company, but not actually have to talk about themselves or about their issues. But they don't have to feel like they are lonely while they're there because they're in amongst a crowd. So it was interesting to hear Greg's perspective as a publican. I wonder why there are some pubs that decide not to have poker machines. I wonder why there are pubs that decide to have poker machines, and that might be a bit of discussion that we could have at the end. But clearly there are pubs who've made a decision not to apply for a poker machine licence. There's also some pubs that apply but don't get it, as I've heard Greg talk about in the past. It's interesting because to hear Greg speak, because we are told that the poker machines brought tourism to Tasmania, has increased our employment, and according to Greg, this is not the case. And in fact, he said that the value of hotels has not changed in 20 years, and yet obviously a lot of us would know that the value of houses have gone up. And as Greg said, losses to the pokies is money that's then not spent in small businesses and in your local shops, where that money is then put back into the local community. That money is taken out of our local community. And I also found it very interesting to hear from Greg about the low skill level required in hotels. I've been to a number of national gambling conferences where gambling venue staff have talked about their difficulty. They've had intensive training on how to identify people with a gambling problem, and then they've been tested on that when they've been put into a room with people gambling, and it is incredibly difficult to work out which of these people standing at the poker machines has got a gambling problem, and two, it's incredibly difficult for them to actually approach them. Not only do the people with a gambling problem often feel shame, but it seems that the gambling venue staff must not feel confident enough in many cases, or feel supported enough to approach. And I ask the question often in Tasmania, where you have local country pubs and you've got local people employed in those country pubs, and often the people employed in those country pubs are young. And I wonder, how can a young person in a country pub feel confident going up to an elder of their community and ask them, "Excuse me, but I think you might have a gambling problem"? I think it's unrealistic, and I think it's unfair to expect young people who've got perhaps their only job, and it might be the only job available in the local community, to do this. Now, obviously they could go to the publican and ask the publican to do it. But it's still part of their job, they're expected to do it, and I think it's unfair to expect them to do this. So Mara then spoke about the human face of gambling, and I think from a counsellor's perspective, Mara gave us a very clear picture of the heartbreak and difficulty that's faced both, I would say, by the person who gambles, but I also got the feeling from the people who hear the stories the people who work, and I know there's a few counsellors here, it's not easy day after day hearing these stories and knowing that the government not only condones the activity but actively does a limited amount to minimise the harm. Mara talked about the ways that people get into gambling problems. She talked about the lack of impulse control, the big win theory, and we heard Karyn talk about wanting that big win, and the environmental factors like a relationship breakdown or a death or loneliness. I would also add health issues, something changing in your current health. And that's certainly what I found when I did my interviews for House of Cards, that it was also when people's health deteriorated. I interviewed someone who had a car crash and found themselves in a wheelchair, and it was a young man, and all he was looking forward to was turning 18 so that he had somewhere that he could go and play on an even level to other people, because he could play the pokies. And he was really excited about being in a venue where he felt he would be seen to be normal. So I think there's a number of issues there in terms of how people get into a gambling problem, and some of those things, some of those pathways are points, I think, where government action could be directed. So government action on loneliness could be looking at where the pokies are and what other activities are available for people. And so we've heard about the swimming club that Mara talked about. Thinking about environmental factors and when relationships break down or when people die, and the sort of counselling that happens, and making sure that relationship type counselling also includes acknowledgement that type of loneliness can isolate people so much that they find drugs, alcohol, gambling as solace, and how do we as a community cope with that? And I think it's particularly important where there's not much else organised for people to do in smaller communities. And then, Karyn, thank you so much for coming along. It is very brave to stand up in front of people and tell your own story. I tell other people's stories, and I always thank people for telling me their stories, but to stand up in front of people that you don't know and telling your own story, and to hear especially that stopping gambling was the hardest thing that you'd ever done. I'm sure you've done other hard things in your life. And I've heard that statement before, where stopping the gambling was harder than stopping other addictions that people had, or stopping a relationship. That the actual stopping of the gambling was the hardest. And while Karyn is not alone in feeling that feeling is with her every day, I'm sure. So I thank especially Karyn for coming along and sharing that. So I would like to come back to, I guess I should rephrase it, do you think the government's doing enough? And if you do not think the government is doing enough, why do you think that the government isn't doing enough? And I would also like to think about, how do some pubs survive without the pokies, while other pubs have said in parliamentary inquiries that they would fold if they didn't have the pokies, or if the pokey maximum bet limit went from $5 to $1. So I think that those are two key questions, because in my mind they are two questions that limit how far the government's willing to go. And I might leave it here and pass it over to Tony.
Thank you, Margie. That's a really helpful summary of what's gone on here. Now, I know from what a few people have said to me that some people have to head off a little earlier than others, so I won't wrap up now, but I would like to make sure, but we do thank those people that need to be thanked for the forum today. This actually was an initiative of Anglicare and TasCOSS, as we've said, but the principal driver was Dr. Wynne Russell, one of the officers of TasCOSS, who can't be here today because she's presenting a research paper in Berlin, so a very good reason for not being here indeed. To our colleagues and friends at Anglicare, thank you very much for arranging for speakers today, to Margie and Maxine. That was very, very good to be able to give a real human face to what we've dealt with here today. I also wanted to recognise too Alderman Sue Hickey and Alderman Helen Burnett are with us today as well. Thank you very much for coming along, along with the heads of a number of organisations and many workers from the field. So we appreciate that very much. Meg, I think we've got afternoon tea pretty well ready to go there. So what can I suggest for those who might be able to stay, we take a 5-minute break, we grab those scones look great. Scone and a cup of tea, and we'll come back and have a general discussion. I'd like to lead off with the question that Maxine left us about what isn't the government doing? Now, we might take some time on that, so let's come back shortly.